A martial arts instructor challenged a custodian to demonstrate sparring techniques for entertainment. But what followed left everyone in the training facility speechless. "Hey, you with the cleaning supplies. How about a quick showcase?" called Marcus Henderson from the middle of the practice area, his advanced rank clearly visible beneath the overhead lighting. "I'm guessing you've never witnessed actual combat before, correct?" Robert Chen paused his floor maintenance and gradually raised his head. At 42, he had been employed as a custodian at this facility for merely 3 weeks, consistently arriving during evening hours after regular participants had departed. However, on this particular Thursday evening, the advanced session had extended beyond its scheduled conclusion. "I'd prefer not to interrupt your training, instructor," Robert responded evenly, resuming his work on a persistent mark on the surface. "Nearly finished here, so you can continue your practice." Marcus released an exaggerated laugh that reverberated throughout the facility. Everyone observed this. This individual is too frightened to even approach the training area. The 8 participants present responded with uncertain laughter, several obviously troubled by the developing situation. Marcus remained unaware that Robert had dedicated the previous 2 decades attempting to completely erase his former identity. 2 decades since departing the competition circuit, following a tragedy that permanently altered his existence. 2 decades concealing a truth that even his adolescent son remained ignorant about. "Come now, friend," Marcus persisted, moving closer with that condescending expression he reserved for novices. "Simply a brief showcase. I'm certain you cannot even execute a fundamental defensive position. How about demonstrating to my students the contrast between dedicated practitioners and those who merely maintain facilities?" Robert experienced that recognizable sensation in his core, like a dormant capability reawakening after years of suppression. His gaze briefly connected with Marcus's, and momentarily, something transferred between them that caused the instructor to involuntarily retreat. "Simply an instructional showcase," Marcus maintained, now attempting to mask the sudden doubt in his tone. "Nothing overly intense, just to demonstrate to beginners why respecting the discipline matters." Robert placed the cleaning container on the surface and rose gradually. His actions possessed a gracefulness that seemed unusual for someone supposedly unfamiliar with martial arts training. Throughout the facility, the students ceased their activities, sensing something significant was unfolding. "Very well," Robert stated eventually, his tone steady like still water before turbulence. "However, when we conclude, you will offer apologies to everyone for transforming the training area into entertainment." Marcus laughed, though this time the sound carried less conviction. "Apologize? Friend, you'll be expressing regrets to the ground when you encounter it." None of these individuals knew that Robert Chen had previously been Robert Quiet Thunder Chen, 5-time global champion in mixed combat sports. He had withdrawn at his career peak following a tragedy that claimed his closest friend and training companion's life. Subsequently, he had vowed never to compete again. However, certain commitments exist to be violated when personal dignity faces challenges. Marcus adjusted his advanced rank with theatrical flair, clearly enjoying every moment of attention. "Everyone gather closer. You're about to witness a practical illustration of why hierarchies exist in combat disciplines." Robert observed as the 8 students formed a semicircle surrounding the training area. Several appeared enthusiastic for the showcase, others visibly distressed. A young woman of Latin descent, with secured hair, whispered something to her nearby colleague, who simply shook his head disapprovingly. "Observe everyone," Marcus continued, gesturing dramatically. "Here we possess a perfect example of someone who never comprehended that appropriate environments exist for particular individuals. Premium facilities are not for, well, you understand." Robert felt that recognizable discomfort in his core, identical to what he experienced 2 decades prior when hearing comparable remarks about competitors who didn't resemble champions. The distinction was that presently, at 42, he had mastered converting frustration into fuel for something far more powerful than physical strikes. Instructor Marcus, the young woman interjected hesitantly. Perhaps we could resume our standard training? It's growing late and... Isabella Morales, are you challenging my instructional approach? Marcus interrupted sharply. Be seated and observe. You'll gain more insight in the following 5 minutes than during a month of conventional instruction. Robert noticed how Marcus utilized the woman's complete name, an obvious demonstration of dominance. He also recognized the expression of apprehension in her eyes, identical to what he had seen reflected in mirrors 2 decades earlier, when awakening in distress, recalling the tragedy that took the life of Miguel Thunder Garcia, his closest friend and training companion. Miguel had perished because of him. That remained undeniable, a sequence of strikes that Robert had delivered with excessive intensity during practice sparring. Miguel collapsed, impacted his head against the surface at an unusual angle, and never regained consciousness. The investigation determined it was unintentional, but Robert understood the reality. He had lost control due to pressure and prejudiced remarks from spectators that evening. So, custodian, Marcus taunted, how about demonstrating to my students how to execute a fundamental defensive position? Or is that too complex for someone who only operates cleaning equipment? Laughter spread throughout the facility, but Robert remained motionless. His eyes briefly closed, and momentarily he was transported back to that arena in Phoenix, hearing identical remarks that forever changed his existence. What's wrong? Are you frightened? Marcus insisted, now circling Robert like a hunter. Or will you simply remain there like furniture, as you do with cleaning tools all day? That was when Marcus committed his first critical error. He lightly pushed Robert's shoulder, an apparently harmless contact, yet one conveying all the arrogance of someone who had never confronted genuine consequences for his behavior. Robert absorbed the push without shifting an inch. His feet remained anchored to the ground like tree roots, and Marcus felt as though he had attempted pushing a concrete barrier. The instructor's arrogant expression faltered momentarily. Intriguing, Robert muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. It's been considerable time since someone attempted provoking me this way. Something in Robert's tone altered the atmosphere. It wasn't menace or rage. It was the unsettling composure of someone who had traversed far darker territories and emerged transformed. Marcus, incapable of interpreting the warning signals, intensified his approach. Did everyone hear that? He considers it intriguing. How about we demonstrate the distinction between contemplating and understanding? Marcus failed to recognize that every degrading statement and action was awakening something in Robert that had remained dormant for 2 decades. Not rage or vengeance desire, but something considerably more dangerous. The crystalline recollection of his true identity when he ceased concealing himself. Isabella Morales observed the scene with increasing unease. Something about the custodian's breathing pattern, the nearly imperceptible muscle tension, reminded her of wildlife documentaries she watched on educational channels. The stillness before action. Final opportunity, friend, Marcus announced, now clearly frustrated by Robert's lack of reaction. Either you accept the showcase appropriately, or I contact security for removal. And speculation. You forfeit your employment too. Robert opened his eyes gradually. When his gaze encountered Marcus's, the instructor felt a chill traverse his spine, as though he had just awakened a dragon he believed was a harmless creature. Very well, Robert stated eventually, his tone low, yet laden with an authority that made everyone present instantly silent. However, when we conclude, I expect you to explain to your students why you transformed a learning environment into a humiliation spectacle. Marcus laughed, but this time the sound conveyed nervousness. Explain. Friend, you'll have considerable explaining to do when you're on the ground. Neither comprehended that Robert had dedicated the previous 2 decades not merely escaping his past, but perfecting an emotional mastery that had transformed his former destructive fury into something far more refined and devastatingly efficient. Each new humiliation merely fueled a silent power within him, a cold resolve that his former opponents knew intimately, but that Marcus was about to discover in the worst conceivable manner. Marcus adjusted his posture, clearly satisfied with the respectful silence that had descended upon the facility. His 8 students formed a perfect circle surrounding the training area, some eager for the showcase, others visibly uncomfortable with the situation developing before them. "Everyone, you are about to witness instruction worth more than 6 months of training," Marcus announced dramatically, extending his arms like a performer. The distinction between those who dedicate their existence to combat disciplines and those who simply, maintain the surfaces where genuine fighters walk. Robert stood motionless in the training area's center, but something had shifted in his breathing. His eyes briefly closed, and momentarily he was no longer in this facility in Seattle. He was back at the championship arena in Phoenix, 22 years ago, hearing identical remarks from spectators before his World Championship match against Viktor the Destroyer Volkov. "Observe that diminutive minority fighter," someone in the seating area had shouted that distant evening. "I'm certain he won't survive 3 rounds against a genuine competitor." Robert had prevailed by technical stoppage in the second round, but the victory had cost him significantly. The pressure from prejudiced remarks had caused him to lose control during the subsequent practice session, resulting in Miguel Garcia's accidental death. "So, custodian," Marcus taunted, now circling Robert like a hunter, "how about demonstrating to my students how not to execute a fundamental defensive position? Or is that too complex for someone who only operates cleaning equipment?" That's when Isabella Morales couldn't remain silent any longer. The 22-year-old advanced practitioner and graduate student in athletic psychology had dedicated the previous 2 years documenting discrimination cases in athletics for her research. What she was witnessing was valuable academic material, but also profoundly disturbing. "Instructor Marcus," she interrupted firmly, "may I pose a question? Why precisely do you believe it's necessary to humiliate someone simply performing his occupation?" The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus slowly turned to Isabella, his eyes narrowing with combined surprise and irritation. "Pardon me, Isabella, but who's conducting this class?" "You are," she replied calmly, "but that shouldn't include ethnic humiliation disguised as technical demonstration." Several students exchanged nervous glances. Nobody had ever confronted Marcus this way before. The instructor felt his face flush with combined anger and embarrassment. "Ethnic?" Marcus laughed forcefully. "This has nothing to do with ethnicity. It has to do with respecting the combat discipline and understanding your position." Robert opened his eyes gradually. Something in the way Isabella had spoken, in the courage of a young woman challenging established authority, reminded him of his younger sister Jasmine. She had possessed that identical determination, that identical refusal to accept injustice silently. Jasmine had died at 17, the victim of a random shooting, during a law enforcement confrontation in her neighborhood. Robert was competing in Singapore when he received the notification. Another person he loved lost while he pursued recognition in distant arenas. Another reason to abandon everything and disappear into the simplicity of an anonymous existence. "Isabella," Marcus stated in a dangerously low tone, "if you cannot respect my instructional methods, perhaps you should seek another facility. There are locations more appropriate to individuals with your perspective." The threat lingered in the air like toxic vapor. Isabella felt a chill traverse her spine, but she maintained her position. "My membership is current, instructor, and I believe that everyone here deserves a learning environment based on mutual respect, not humiliation." That's when Robert did something nobody anticipated. He began to smile. It wasn't a nervous or submissive smile. It was the gradual, calculated smile of someone who had just found a reason to stop concealing. For 2 decades, he had carried the burden of guilt for 2 deaths that had indirectly resulted from his involvement in the combat world. Now witnessing a courageous young woman defending justice principles that he had abandoned decades ago, Robert Chen began to remember his true identity. "Marcus," Robert stated eventually, his tone carrying a quiet authority that made everyone in the room turn to him. "The young woman is correct. This isn't about combat disciplines. It's about you attempting to feel significant by diminishing others." Marcus spun on his heels, his face red with indignation. "How dare you lecture me about combat disciplines? You don't even understand what a training hall is." Robert took a step forward, and something fundamental changed in his posture. His shoulders straightened, his center of gravity lowered imperceptibly, and his feet positioned themselves in a stance that any experienced competitor would instantly recognize as perfect. "Actually," Robert stated calmly, "I understand precisely what a training hall is, and I understand that this location stopped being one considerable time ago." Marcus felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. Something about the way Robert moved presently, the way he occupied the space, that awakened all of his survival instincts. But his wounded pride would not permit him to retreat. "Enough conversation," Marcus growled, assuming his preferred combat stance. "I'll teach you respect the difficult way." Isabella observed the scene with growing apprehension, but also with professional fascination. She had documented hundreds of hours of practice sessions in competitions for her research, and something about the custodian's movements reminded her of the great masters she had studied in historical footage. The economy of movement, the controlled breathing, the calm presence that radiated contained power. Robert briefly closed his eyes and allowed 22 years of muscle memory to resurface. Every technique perfected, every victory achieved, every lesson learned in the most brutal arenas worldwide. When he opened them again, Marcus was looking directly into the eyes of Quiet Thunder Chen, 5-time global mixed combat sports champion. "Final opportunity to apologize," Robert offered kindly. "To her, to your students, and to transform this location back into a learning space." Marcus laughed, but the sound emerged nervous and forced. "Apologize? Friend, you'll be requesting forgiveness when you're on the ground." What Marcus couldn't perceive was that Robert had already identified all of his technical deficiencies. The elevated guard that left his torso exposed, the tendency to retreat with his right leg first, the way he telegraphed his strikes with micro-movements of his shoulder. 22 years away from the arena had not erased decades of refined technical analysis. Isabella noticed that other students were instinctively retreating, like wild animals sensing an approaching storm. Something in the room's energy had completely changed, as if the air had become electrically charged before a lightning strike. It was when everyone laughed at Marcus's latest taunts that something unexpected began to take shape in Robert's expression. Not anger or revenge desire, but the calm determination of someone who had found a cause worth violating a 20-year vow of silence for. Several of those present began to recognize that something extraordinary was about to occur, even without fully comprehending what their eyes were witnessing. Marcus assumed his preferred combat stance, the one he had used to intimidate hundreds of beginners over the years. Feet shoulder-width apart, fists positioned at chest level, weight slightly forward, the classic stance of someone who had learned combat disciplines in controlled environments against predictable opponents. Robert stood motionless for several seconds, simply observing. His eyes scanned Marcus from head to toe, automatically cataloging every technical detail. The elevated guard that left his ribs exposed, the unstable foundation that compromised his balance, the excessive tension in his shoulders that telegraphed every move before it even commenced. "Still waiting," Marcus taunted, bouncing slightly on his feet. "Or will you simply remain there like furniture?" That's when Robert did something nobody anticipated. He started to move. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, just a subtle repositioning of his feet, a slight lowering of his center of gravity, his shoulders relaxing into a perfectly horizontal line. But to anyone who understood what to observe, the transformation was instantaneous and frightening. Isabella Chen felt a chill run down her spine. During 2 years studying athletic biomechanics, she had analyzed hundreds of hours of footage of great competitors. What she had just witnessed was the transition from an ordinary man to a born predator, a change as subtle as it was devastating. "Intriguing," Marcus muttered, his confidence wavering for the first time. Something about the way Robert occupied the space presently awakened all of his self-preservation instincts. Robert took a step forward, and Marcus instinctively retreated. The movement was so involuntary, so primitive, that several students noticed. An advanced instructor retreating from a custodian? The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. "Problem?" Robert asked softly, his tone carrying a quiet authority that silenced everyone. Marcus felt the blood rush to his cheeks. His reputation was being questioned before his own students. He couldn't retreat now, even though every fiber of his being was screaming at him to stop and apologize. "No problem," Marcus replied, forcing a smile. "Just admiring your posture." "Did someone teach you that on online tutorials?" The joke fell flat. Nobody laughed. The tension in the room had become almost tangible. "Actually," Robert stated calmly, "I learned it at a location called the Phoenix National Training Center. Perhaps you've heard of it?" Marcus frowned. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place the reference. "Phoenix? What kind of weekend intensive did you do there?" Isabella Chen discreetly retrieved her phone from her pocket and quickly typed, "Phoenix National Training Center Martial Arts." What she found made her blood run cold. This wasn't just any preparation course. It was where the world's greatest mixed combat champions of the previous 3 decades had trained. "Marcus," Robert continued, his tone still calm. "Final opportunity. Apologize to Isabella for questioning her right to speak. Apologize to your students for transforming this location into entertainment. And most importantly, apologize to yourself for becoming precisely the kind of person that combat disciplines should teach you not to be." The offer of clemency lingered in the air like smoke. Marcus could have chosen humility. He could have acknowledged that he had crossed a line. He could have preserved what little dignity he had remaining. Instead, he attacked. Marcus's first strike was technically perfect. A fast, accurate jab, executed precisely as he had learned in the manuals. It was the kind of strike that worked against 99% of the people he had practiced with over the years. Robert wasn't in the 99%. The movement was so fast, so fluid, that half of those present couldn't even process what had occurred. Robert simply wasn't where Marcus's fist had been aimed. His body had slid to the side like water flowing around a rock, and suddenly Marcus was off balance, his arm extended into empty space. "Nice attempt," Robert commented softly, "already repositioned and perfectly balanced. Clean technique, adequate speed. But you telegraphed the move with your right shoulder." Marcus spun wildly, attempting to locate his opponent. How had someone moved so fast? "Beginner's luck," he muttered, more to himself than to Robert. The second attack came in quick succession. Jab, straight, hook. 3 strikes linked together with the precision of someone who had practiced the combination thousands of times. It was his preferred sequence, the one he used to finish practice sessions and impress beginners. Again, Robert simply wasn't there. This time, Isabella managed to follow the movement. Robert had lowered himself slightly, allowing the jab to pass over his head by inches. The straight strike found only air when he leaned back in an impossible curve. And when Marcus threw the hook with all his strength, Robert took a small step back, causing the fist to pass millimeters from his chin. "Intriguing combination," Robert observed, still breathing evenly. "Works well against individuals who stand still. But you're leaving your left side completely exposed after the hook." Marcus was starting to sweat. This wasn't normal. He had landed thousands of strikes in his life, and now he couldn't land a single one on a man who had supposedly never competed before. "Stop dancing and fight," Marcus shouted, launching an even more aggressive sequence. That's when Robert decided the demonstration had gone on long enough. Marcus's third attack, a desperate combination of strikes and kicks, found only air once again. But this time, something different occurred. When Marcus recovered after missing all his blows, Robert was inexplicably closer. "How?" Marcus whispered, realizing he had completely lost control of the distance. "Marcus," Robert stated softly, now an arm's length away, "do you want to understand the distinction between someone who learned to compete in facilities and someone who learned in professional arenas?" Before Marcus could answer, Robert did something that defied everything those present thought they knew about physics. Without appearing to use any force, without any sudden or aggressive movements, he simply contacted Marcus on the chest with the palm of his right hand. Marcus flew. He wasn't pushed or knocked down. He was literally propelled backwards, as if struck by an invisible wave. His feet left the ground. He traveled nearly 2 meters through the air and landed on his back with an impact that made everyone in the room gasp. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus lay on the floor for several seconds, staring at the ceiling, attempting to process what had occurred. There was no pain, just the irresistible force of someone operating on a level completely different from anything he had ever known. "That," Marcus muttered, attempting to rise. "That's impossible." Isabella Chen had stopped breathing. In 2 years of studying combat disciplines, she had never witnessed such a controlled and devastating display of power. There was no brutality, no anger, just the clinical application of a technique she had only seen in legends. "Actually," Robert stated calmly, extending his hand to help Marcus to his feet, "it's quite simple once you understand leverage, timing, and energy transfer. Principles I've learned over a 22-year professional career." Marcus ignored the extended hand and stood up on his own, his legs still shaking. 22 years? Professional career in what?" Isabella answered, her tone almost a whisper. "You don't comprehend who he is, do you?" Everyone turned to her, who was still holding her cell phone with the search results displayed. On the screen, dozens of articles, photos, and videos confirmed what her instincts had already recognized. "Robert Chen," she read aloud, "also known as Quiet Thunder. 5-time global mixed combat sports champion. Considered one of the best technical competitors in history. Retired undefeated after a 22-year career, following a tragedy that resulted in his training companion's death." The impact of the words hit the room like a bomb. Marcus felt his face go pale as reality set in. He had challenged a living combat disciplines legend. He had publicly humiliated someone who could have incapacitated him with a casual move. Five-time global champion," Marcus stammered, all his arrogance evaporating instantly. Robert nodded silently. "I retired at 29. Subsequently, I've been working whatever occupations I can find. Maintenance, cleaning, simple occupations, simple existence. No spotlight, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone." The transformation in Marcus was instantaneous and painful to observe. The arrogant man was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of his ignorance. "I didn't know," Marcus whispered. "If I had known—" "If you had known, would you have treated me with respect?" Robert interrupted gently. "But would you still have humiliated some other custodian? Another worker who had no credentials to defend himself?" The question cut deeper than any physical blow. Marcus realized that Robert had identified the root of his genuine problem, not ignorance about his credentials, but the fundamental arrogance that made him believe he could humiliate individuals based on their occupations. Isabella stepped forward, her tone firm. "Instructor Marcus, for 2 years I have trained at this academy out of respect for your experience. But what I witnessed today was not teaching. It was bullying disguised as instruction." Other students began to murmur in agreement. The revelation about Robert had completely changed everyone's perspective on what they had witnessed. "Robert," Marcus stated finally, his tone laden with remorse. "I sincerely apologize. To you, to Isabella, to everyone here. I have no excuse for my behavior." Robert nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace with which he had mastered the physical confrontation. "Appreciated, Marcus. But apologies are only the first step. The question is, what will you do differently from now on?" Marcus looked around the room, seeing his students with new eyes. Some seemed disappointed in his behavior, others clearly reevaluating everything they thought they understood about respect and hierarchy. "I'll change," Marcus promised. "It'll require time, but I'll change." That's when Isabella asked a question that surprised everyone. "Mr. Chen, would you consider teaching again? Because I believe we could all learn far more from someone who understands that true strength comes with responsibility." Robert smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that evening. "Perhaps, but not to teach combat techniques. To teach something far more important. That respect isn't earned with ranks or championships, but with character." As Marcus fully absorbed the most humiliating lesson of his existence, one question lingered in the air. Would one evening of humility be sufficient to transform decades of arrogance, or would an even deeper change be necessary for true justice to be served? 3 months later, the facility had been completely transformed. Robert Chen was no longer just the custodian. Isabella Chen had convinced the facility owner to hire him as an instructor, specializing in advanced techniques and combat disciplines philosophy. Marcus Henderson lost half of his students in the first week after the incident. The video Isabella had discreetly recorded spread across social media, showing an advanced instructor being humiliated by a mere custodian. His reputation in the combat disciplines community was ruined. "Instructor Robert," Isabella stated after a class on respect and humility, "thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be displayed to be recognized." Robert smiled, organizing the equipment. "The best lesson I can teach is simple. Never judge someone by their occupation or appearance. Everyone carries stories that can surprise us." Marcus continued teaching at a smaller facility, but now with a humility forced by public shame. He had learned the difficult way that arrogance comes at a price. Sometimes justice comes quietly, like a storm that transforms everything without making a sound. Robert proved that the true revenge is not destroying your opponent, but showing that greatness comes from character, not titles.